I think that with the trans community, it's very similar to the gay community, where back when that first became a big issue, people thought, oh, if we talk about it, if it's in magazines or whatever, we're promoting kids to go down that path. But really what happened is people are who they are. And if they're gay, they just decided to be like, yeah, I'm gay. And they were just more open and honest with themselves. So I don't think you're promoting people to do that.
No, that's
you're just
not
saying,
what happened.
if you are that, it's okay.
Wrong.
Okay. Well,
you're utterly wrong.
I'm listening.
There's nothing about that that's right.
In today's video, Kyle Kulinski absolutely destroys Jordan Peterson in a heated debate about LGBTQ. Peterson came in swinging with his usual talking points about compelled speech, pronouns, and the so-called dangers of radical gender ideology. But Kyle brought the receipts, the calm, and the logic, and absolutely dismantled the fear-mongering, while Peterson framed the LGBTQ rights as a threat to free speech or tradition. Kyle flipped the script, pointing out that recognizing people's identities isn't oppression, it's just basic respect. He hit back with real-world examples, science-backed facts, and a reminder that actual freedom includes letting people live their lives without being legislated out of existence. So let's dive in and watch how Kyle Kulinski shuts down Jordan Peterson in this heated debate.
So explain.
Well, there's been an absolute look. One of the reasons that I opposed Bill C-16 in Canada to begin with, this pronoun compelled speech bill, was because I knew perfectly well what was going to happen when we introduced confusion about gender identity into the public sphere. Now, the argument was that if we left people with gender dysphoria alone to make their own way and stop torturing them, that we would decrease the mental health load on those individuals. And my analysis as a clinician was that for every one person of that sort that we hypothetically saved, we doom 1,000 more as a consequence of confusion and social contagion. I knew the literature on psychogenic epidemics. They used to call that mass hysteria, and it's a literature that goes back about 300 years. And often when you introduce social confusion, you can produce a psychogenic epidemic, especially among, generally it's adolescent females who are most susceptible to it. So I thought, oh, well, what's going to happen is we'll produce a psychogenic epidemic of gender dysphoria among adolescent females. And that is exactly what's happened. And it isn't the fact that we've freed up people who are, in doubt about their identity to be who they are. That may have happened in a tiny minority of cases. It's absolutely and definitely the case that we've doomed thousands of kids to brutal, mutilating surgery and premature sterility. And we've done that on the altar of our hypothetical moral virtue and compassion. Look, I read a corporate analysis of the trans surgery industry last week. Growth rate projection for you lefty types and your anti-corporatism. Growth rate projection, 15% per year. Invest now. A $350 million business as of 2022, projected to expand to $750 million by 2027. No moral hazard there? There's plenty of moral hazard there. And that surgery is absolutely brutal.
Now let's get this straight. The idea that trans visibility is causing a sudden surge in young people identifying as trans isn't new, but it's also been debunked. Studies show that increase in openly trans youth is largely due to greater social acceptance and awareness, not confusion or hysteria. It's the same thing we saw with gay rights. People didn't become gay because they saw it in the media, they just finally felt safe enough to be themselves. Kyle said it perfectly. Being visible doesn't promote an identity, it simply makes it safer to express one. Peterson also brought up the trans surgery industry as some kind of sinister profit machine, but that's wildly misleading. First, gender-affirming surgeries are not easily accessible. They're heavily regulated, often requires years of therapy and diagnosis, and are usually only approved for adults, not kids. In fact, the majority of trans youth don't pursue medical intervention at all. What most ask for is simple: respect, names, pronouns, and the space to exist. Kyle kept the conversations grounded in that reality. He He wasn't dismissive of nuance, but he didn't entertain scare tactics either. He reminded us that treating people with dignity and respect isn't some radical leftist experiment, it's basic human decency.
So what percentage of the population do you think, in your conception of how this is unfolding, what percentage of the population do you think is going to end up being trans at the end of this? Do you think like one day it's going to be like 70% of the country is trans?
We know already that about 1 in 5 adolescents now identifies, to use that hated word, identifies as part of the hypothetical LGBTQ plus community. So it's 1 in 5. I don't know what the upper limit is. There's a consulting group in the UK now that's claiming there's 150 different genders. There's actually, I suppose, 7 billion different genders, if you want to get technical about it, because everybody's temperament differs. But I don't know what the upper limit is. And I have no idea what the upper limit is for this surgical intervention. We'll see. But I don't find it, I don't find it the least bit acceptable. And if you think that your compassion is demanding that you extend your pity to the LGBTQ plus community at the cost of sterilizing children, you should think again. You're on the wrong side of this, and not in a trivial way.
I would appreciate if you don't ascribe beliefs to me that I don't have. Remember, my original question was about...
you said earlier in this question that,
I said
that
Elliot Page is an adult, and so do you think that he has the right to transition? That was the original question.
You made some comments after that. Yeah, but as a star and a public figure and a model for emulation, she also has the responsibility not to entice confused adolescents into a catastrophic decision before they have the maturity to make that decision.
I just have to say, Jordan, I think it's a little bit of a moral panic. I just don't see some sort of, frenzy of people wanting to become trans.
First of all, that's a hell of a way to put it.
Why
don't you take a look at the increase in surgical interventions and see what you think? I mean, how many do you think is too many?
Again,
if we're talking about
I'll answer your question. The argument is it used to be very repressed because that's very outside of the tradition and the norm and the standard, and that now we sort of let the boot off the neck a little bit.
What used to be suppressed?
The entire LGBTQ community. I mean, it was very recently we even got gay marriage in the United States.
First of all, they're not a community.
Well, you understand the point I'm making.
No, actually, neither I understand it nor you, and that's why we're delving into it. First of all, they're not a community. That's just a catchphrase. It's a buzzword. And I'll tell you something else, that almost all the kids who are undergoing surgical intervention, the clinical literature is absolutely clear on this. 80% of kids with gender dysphoria identify as homosexual when they mature. 80%. And that means the vast majority of people who are being converted surgically are gay. Now, how is that an advantage to the gay community precisely?
No, see, I'm not taking a position in any way, shape, or form on the kids, because I don't know the first thing about this to comment on the kids. Well, but see, that's why we're having this conversation, though, is because my original question was about the adults and what your take is on the adults. And it sounds to me like, let me ask you guys, would you ban transition surgery for adults?
I don't know.
Really?
Peterson went deep into full-on culture war panic mode, talking about 150 genders, framing being trans as a social contagion, and making wild claims about kids being converted surgically. He kept throwing out stats like 80% of kids with gender dysphoria grows up to be gay, but that completely misrepresents what the actual research says. Kyle did a solid job staying grounded, calmly calling this what it is, a moral panic, not a public health crisis. Here's the reality. Trans people make up less than 1% of the population, even with increased visibility. That 1 in 5 number Peterson referenced, that's not about trans identity. It includes anyone under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, which spans everything from being gay or bi to questioning. That's not a wave of confused kids. That's just more people feeling safe enough to be honest. And when Kyle pressed Peterson on adult transition rights, Peterson deflected. He didn't want to give a straight answer because the logic of his argument falls apart there. If you're truly about individual freedom, then denying consenting adults their right to transition makes no sense at all. But Peterson kept pivoting, shifting the conversation back to confused adolescents and slippery slope arguments.
Yeah, really, we're paying a big price for it, and I think that it was an act of stunning hubris to conduct the first trans surgery procedure. And it's not obvious to me at all that it's been a net social good. And
but aren't there some people that are obviously trans who were born in one body, they feel like they're in the other body, and when they're an adult, they can make the decision? And then even from just a freedom and liberty perspective, shouldn't they have that right? Even if they do it and then they regret it, shouldn't they have the right to try it?
It's a good question. I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because there's all sorts of surgical enhancement procedures that are it's not obviously appropriate to make them illegal. And I don't know exactly where the cutoff line is, so to speak. And that's partly why we're having a public discussion about it. But this entire argument, in many ways, is stated so idiotically that it almost defies description. I mean, what do you mean, feel like you're in the wrong body? Well, what kind of measurement is that? Now, hang on a sec. There are rules for these sorts of diagnostic decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The rule is that you have to make a valid and reliable diagnosis. That's if you're diagnosing depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder or cancer or anything like that. There are standards that you have to abide by in order to make a diagnosis, in order to fulfill the obligations of your professional college. If someone comes to you and says, I feel like I have lung cancer, that is not sufficient grounds upon which to formulate a diagnosis, much less proceed to surgery.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, what do you mean by feel? What is that? Is that an emotion? Is it a motivation? Is it a philosophical conclusion? What is it?
Let me explain to you what I mean. So I've been doing my show for about a decade, and about 2 or 3 years into doing my show, there were, some stories here and there that I covered about the trans issue. Somebody who is trans reached out to me and explained to me in a very straightforward way, yeah, look, I was born biologically female. I feel like I'm biologically male. My reality never lined up. Well, I'm just explaining what they said, and then you can respond however you'd like to respond. And they told me as soon as I got the surgery, changed the way I dressed, changed the way I appeared, I felt phenomenally better. And so that's why, at least for me, this was the answer. Now, I think it would be incredibly arrogant for me to say back to that person, no, you shouldn't do that, or I know better than you do for yourself. Now, that's not to say that every time somebody does this, it works out well, of course, because everybody's an individual. But in some instances, that's the answer. So, me as a simple outsider, I just look at it and say, hey, whatever floats your boat, and if it works, it works.
Look, most of the time, my attitude is you can go to hell in handbasket any way you choose if you're an adult. Now, this problem is complicated and compounded by the fact of the necessity of medical involvement and the ethics on the medical front. So when you asked me about how that should be regulated, my answer was I'm not exactly sure about that.
Yeah,
although it isn't obvious to me that it's obvious to me that the trans surgery enterprise has gone way too far, thousands of people too far. And I'm certain that it's harmed exponentially more people than it's helped.
Now, Peterson kept pressing the question, what does it mean to feel like you're in the wrong body? As if that personal experience needs to pass a scientific metric to be valid. But this isn't new or unexplored territory. Gender dysphoria is a medically recognized condition, and people have been transitioning with medical guidance for decades. We don't ask people with depression to prove their sadness with a blood test. We assess through lived experience, mental health evaluations, and clinical guidelines, just like with gender dysphoria. Kyle handled it with the right attitude. Listen to the people living the experience. One story he shared, a trans person explaining how transitioning changed their lives for the better, highlighted something Peterson kept dodging: the autonomy and agency of trans people. It's not for Jordan or anyone else to tell someone they don't know what's best for themselves. What really stood out is that while Peterson was fixated on controlling or doubting the system, Kyle was focused on letting people make informed decisions for themselves. He acknowledged it's not perfect, but his approach was pretty clear. Trust people, let adults live freely, and listen to the overwhelmingly scientific conscious, not fear-driven hypotheticals. In the end, Kyle showed up with empathy, logic, and respect. Peterson, not so much. And in a debate about human rights and dignity, that makes all the difference. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out ground news in the description down below.